Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Natasha Hall is a senior fellow in the Middle East program at CSIS. She's the author of a new report from the CSIS Middle East program, Rescuing Aid in Syria. And we're delighted to have her join us today. Natasha, welcome to Babel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, John.
Congratulations on this new report. You wrote about the problems of more than a decade of providing humanitarian aid to Syria. Why did you think this was an important issue?
Well, today, what we see is this beautiful country that's been pulverized. Families have been shattered. There are families displaced from Germany all the way. I've met Syrians in Langkawi Island in Malaysia. Families have been ripped apart. Even the society down to the level of cement has been shattered in Syria. I've interviewed mothers with children that have lung infections because they breathe in the particulate matter from, things that are kicked up from constant bombardment. So this is a country that's really bleeding, and we don't see any end in sight. There's no sort of politically acceptable solution to this conflict, this awful conflict on the horizon. And so really the entire international community has decided that aid and diplomacy are going to be the way that they resolve this crisis. And what I've essentially seen over the past 10 years from the practitioner side in the humanitarian world, but also on the analyst side, is that aid has tended to be a kind of pat on the back for donor governments to feel like they're doing something in Syria. And as a result of that dependence on aid, the Syrian government has manipulated the aid system to its benefit and to its allies' benefit, and has deprived those in desperate need. And so I felt that, 10 years in, as we're looking towards early recovery, as it's clear that the Assad government might stay in power, what can we do to rescue aid and actually help Syrians in need? And
you worked, before you came to CSS, you worked in the humanitarian field for more than a decade. A lot of that time spent in the Middle East, a lot of that time spent on Syria. You knew a lot coming into writing this report. As you researched the report, you spoke to more than 130 people. What surprised you didn't expect to learn that you did?
I think I didn't expect to see such understanding of the problems across the board. I spoke to UN officials, I spoke to international NGOs, local NGOs, donor government representatives, and they all see these problems. They're all very concerned about these problems. But I think in a lot of cases, because they've been siloed in their individual corners, whether it's a specific UN agency or an NGO, they feel almost powerless to stop this manipulation.
Is the Syria situation different from humanitarian situations elsewhere? Is there something where Syria is a sort of an especially difficult case for the humanitarian community? And if so, why?
Yeah, I think that I've thought about this a lot because I've seen the good, bad, and the ugly out there from Thailand to Kenya to Syria. And I do think that there's a few things that make Syria different, but what worries me is that it might not be different for long. And let me tell you why. One thing is that these crises are lasting much longer than they ever have before. The humanitarian world is being asked to do much more than it ever did before. So that's one thing that makes Syria different. The other thing is just the sheer amount of assistance that's going into Syria that I think was attractive to nefarious actors in the government as well. But I think also what you have in Syria, and this is really crucial, is that you have a government that really stayed intact for the most part. And that's not often the case with humanitarian crises. I interviewed one career UN official who said when she worked in Libya, she spoke to a minister of health that had no staff. So that was simply not the case in Syria, and that allowed the government to really surveil, monitor, and kind of completely control, essentially, the aid apparatus in a way that we may not have seen in other contexts, and they did it in a very savvy way.
And you said that in many ways, the government had already been engaging with the international community on assistance, and that sort of almost gave them a head start when they had a crisis to steer the crisis to serve their interests.
Right. So I was actually in Syria working with Iraqi refugees before the protests started.
In 2011.
In 2010. Yes, just before. And, I had seen sort of individual bad apples within aid agencies, but certainly during that period of time, Syria has accepted, tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees, and since Bashar al-Assad has come to power, there's been an influx of UN agencies, international NGOs. So prior to the protests starting, they already kind of knew how to work the system.
And they've gotten tens of billions of dollars of aid assistance coming in, and the government's managed to get its hands on a lot of it. How does that work?
Well, I think it works through several different ways. And the way that I'll sort of divide this out is that, through diversion, which we see in, I think, unfortunately, a lot of humanitarian crises around the world, and that can be the military diverting food baskets for themselves or medical supplies. We've seen these in wars and conflicts all over the world. I've also mentioned and noted the exchange rate, which is also an issue, throughout the world. But this is a way for the Syrian government to essentially skim off the top between 30 to 75% between 2020 and 2021, any aid money that's spent in the country. But then you have this manipulation where you are able to hire those that you want within aid agencies, give visas to those that you want, and then co-opt, threaten, or kill those that don't go along with what you want. And so we're in this situation where the government and its allies can essentially dictate who gets certain contracts. And as I point out in the report, oftentimes these contracts are doled out to people with direct ties or directly implicated in human rights violations and war crimes.
Now, your report is divided into three very different areas. How do those areas differ from each other, and how does this diversion, manipulation, control differ from area to area?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, I divided them up into different geographic areas of control. So the Syrian Democratic Forces controlled area in the northeast, the opposition controlled northwest, and then government controlled areas. The reason I did that is because I think that the challenges are quite different in each area of control. And that was borne out through the research as well. While I did see interference in the Northeast and the Northwest, it wasn't at the same level of sort of ubiquitousness or control that the government has in government-controlled areas. But I saw other challenges to the aid sector. The constant uncertainty, for example, in the Northwest as to whether or not the UN cross-border mandate will be renewed every year.
And the cross-border mandate, just for people who aren't familiar, if you could just explain that.
So in 2014, the UN Security Council agreed to allow the UN to implement aid cross-border without the government's approval in 4 different border crossings around the country. Today...
into areas the government didn't
Into
control.
areas that the government did not control at the time, correct. But since about 2019, the Russians and the Chinese, both permanent members of the Security Council, have either closed border crossings or threatened to close the last border crossing, which is Babel in the northwest, which serves about 4 million people.
You talk several times in the report about sort of the bad habits that the international humanitarian community has fallen into in Syria, because this was never intended to be a long-term, it is never intended to be the long-term operation it's turned into. It's been going on for more than a decade. What are some of those habits we've fallen into, and how do we break those bad habits?
I think it's really hard. This is not easy. I've been in the aid sector. Oftentimes when you're on the ground, you have all kinds of different priorities in front of you. You need to spend money. You're putting out fires, sometimes literally and figuratively. And you have to deal with some really nasty actors at the same time to get aid in and to deliver what people need. And I think at the beginning of all of this, the government actually established their red lines pretty clearly right away. They said that the aid needed to be delivered, for example, through the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, which is a government, now very much a government-affiliated organization. You know, the UN hadn't agreed to that before. The UN hadn't agreed to state military escorts for aid convoys before. But all of these compromises were sort of rapidly made because the humanitarian community thought they would get access, and they didn't. And we saw that during what I unfortunately call the besieged era, where we saw hundreds of thousands of people basically starved into submission by the government. And we still have those compromises. SARC and now Asma al-Assad's organization, the Syria Trust for Development, still basically monopolize the aid apparatus.
SARC is the Syrian Arab Red Crescent.
Exactly. So, we're still in this very tangled web that the government has created. And I think that the government was especially very good at dividing and conquering the aid community. They tried to sideline OCHA, which is sort of the UN body that's supposed to coordinate all of these different activities, because they didn't want aid agencies to coordinate. They wanted all of them to be vying for attention and compromising with them with different line ministries.
Is this the way the Syrian government works with Syrians in normal times as well?
I think absolutely. I mean, this is a regime that is historically excellent at psychological operations and manipulation. So I think that this was somewhat to be expected, but I don't think any of us could have predicted just the scale and severity of the violence. And, you know, the humanitarian community is somewhat stuck in the middle. But one thing I will say is that it took the entire international community to shrug or to look away for this to happen. This wasn't any one aid worker, any one aid agency, or donor governments. Everyone had to be at play and not to push for more reforms for this to happen.
You have a long list of recommendations, and I just want you to give us the most important ones with each category. One is there needs to be informed action. What do you mean by informed action, and how does the international community pursue informed action?
Well, there's been myriad evaluations and reports about the aid sector, and a lot of those recommendations have been shelved. And so one thing that I do recommend that donor governments specifically do, because they have the resources to do this and they also have the sort of the power to do so, is to do a comprehensive evaluation and audit of the response to date. And the reason I say this is because often when I was, speaking with donor government representatives and others, they say, well, at least the majority of aid is getting to people in need. I think we can actually question that at this point. And we need to have an evaluation to really understand the extent, the scale of the manipulation and diversion. And I think without that information, it's difficult to move forward or know where to go next.
You talk about diplomacy. Where does diplomacy fit into this?
So diplomacy and negotiations, I think the way I see it is that it needs to happen on the ground and it needs to happen at the highest levels. So on the ground, what I mean is that, in the Northwest, we've seen groups like Hayat Tahrir Sham begin to sort of manipulate aid. Now, I argue that the aid community and donor governments actually have far more leverage over HTS to reduce that interference. But you need those constant negotiations. You need that collective leverage in order for that to happen. And then at the highest levels, there simply needs to be a much more comprehensive effort that somewhat incorporates aid into diplomacy surrounding Syria and looking at aid as really a strategic investment in the Syrian people.
Talking about strategic investment, you talk about the need to promote resilience in Syria. How does the aid community do that?
So there's been a lot of talk about early recovery in Syria, primarily in government-held areas, because many find it controversial because it can actually allude to building state capacities, which obviously could be controversial for the humanitarian sector. But what I argue is that we should also be talking about resilience and early recovery in the Northeast and the Northwest. these are areas that the needs are rising dramatically. We see people dying in, these freezing cold winters every year in the Northwest. People are still living in these flimsy tents, and they're all entirely reliant on an unreliable UN cross-border mandate. So we need to start promoting resilience in these areas and promoting resilience and stability in these areas as well by securing ceasefires so that we can have this aid not just go completely to waste in another offensive, for example.
And the last category you talk about is facilitation. What's that mean?
There's been a lot of discussion about sanctions and counterterrorism measures and how they've affected, the aid world. And my argument is that while counterterrorism measures and sanctions are vitally important to ensure that, assistance or material support doesn't get to, odious characters, the way that they are occurring right now is not really beneficial, let's say, for that goal. Because essentially everyone is fearful that any kind of mention of difficulties with terrorist actors or with sanctioned actors will shut down programming altogether. And the other issue is just banking and de-risking. So aid organizations can't get the money they need into Syria, they can't get the resources into Syria. So I don't think that sanctions and counterterrorism measures alone should be the only, proof of due diligence. I think due diligence also needs to happen when you look at the people that you're procuring with, the people that you're implementing with on an individual level to ensure that these kinds of characters, of these actors, are not gaining from the aid system.
It's a really impressive report. It's 70 pages of fact-finding, as I said, more than 130 interviews. Who do you think on the organizational level is going to be happiest with your report, and who do you think is going to be frustrated and why?
That's a good question. I don't entirely have the answer to that, but I would say that I think those that have to be a public face for aid agencies might be frustrated that they have to address some of these issues in the open. But I would say that, the majority of people I interviewed are UN officials and NGO workers and aid workers themselves. And they want this information to get out. And they're trying to do their best in a really, really bad situation, but they can't do it alone. And frankly, there's been UN reviews and internal reports that have said just that. So I think that this is hopefully an opportunity for donor governments, the international community, the aid community to come together and create something better. I mean, I look at this report as kind of my Valentine, if you will, to the aid world. I believe in aid, and I want it to be preserved. I want it to be the sanctified thing that we think it all is. But we need to do better than this.
Natasha, congratulations on the report, and thank you for joining us on Babel.
Thank you, Jon.